The bells rang like a cruel joke that afternoon, slow, heavy, echoing through the dust-filled air of Dry Creek. Nayeli's heart pounded under the rough fabric of the white dress they had forced on her. The cloth scratched her skin. The veil smelled of someone else's perfume, a ghost of another woman, maybe another promise. She stood before the wooden altar, eyes down, hands trembling against the bouquet of wilted flowers. She could feel them watching. Dozens of pale faces in stiff collars, their whispers cutting sharper than any blade. The savage girl. The peace offering. Every breath she took seemed to disturb the stillness they demanded from her. Thomas Gable, her groom, stood at her side, smiling the way men smile before a cruel joke. When the preacher asked for the vows, Thomas laughed. That sound. She would remember it for years. He stepped back, voice rising so everyone could hear. I won't marry a savage. The ring fell into the dust between them. The silence that followed was colder than the desert night. Even the preacher's eyes slid away, as though her humiliation might be contagious. Nayeli's throat burned. She wanted to speak, to tell them she had believed that she had wanted peace too, but her voice stayed trapped behind pride and fear. Someone laughed from the crowd. Another spat on the ground. Her vision blurred. The world shrank until all she could see was the floor, the wood grain beneath her bare feet, the tremor of her own breathing. She thought, if I move, they win. If I cry, they win. And then footsteps. Heavy, steady, echoing closer. She lifted her eyes. A man was walking down the aisle. His coat was worn, his boots coated in red dust. He didn't belong to them. When he stopped beside her, the light caught the scars along his jaw, the calm in his storm-colored eyes. He took off his hat slow, deliberate, and offered his hand. He didn't speak. He couldn't. But something in his silence reached her like a whisper only her soul could hear. For the first time since this began, she breathed. Her fingers moved on their own. She placed her hand into his. The air shifted. Murmurs faded into wind. He nodded once, gently, and led her toward the open door. The light outside was blinding, golden, fierce like freedom itself. Behind them, the church doors closed with a hollow thud. Ahead, only the endless desert waited. And somewhere in her chest, something fragile pride, maybe hope, began to breathe again. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to Wild West Love Stories, where mercy speaks softly, and silence can still mean love. The town disappeared behind her like a bad dream swallowed by the dust. Nayeli didn't look back. She couldn't. Each step away from those walls felt like peeling off a piece of shame that had clung to her skin. Her bare feet burned against the sun-baked road, but the pain was nothing compared to the weight inside her chest. The man, the silent cowboy, walked ahead, leading his horse by the reins. He hadn't spoken a single word since they left the church. His silence wasn't cruel, though. It was steady, like the earth itself, something she could lean on without asking why. The desert stretched wide before them, a golden emptiness that seemed to promise nothing and everything all at once. The sun pressed hard on her shoulders. Sweat stung her eyes. She stumbled once, nearly falling, but he turned quickly, catching her arm before she hit the ground. His touch was rough, calloused, and careful. He didn't hold too long, didn't pity her, just made sure she could stand again. For the first time in hours, she looked at his face. He met her eyes, and in that moment she realized he wasn't just mute. There was something in him that had forgotten how to speak long before he lost his voice. And somehow, she understood that kind of silence better than any words. When they reached the ridge outside Dry Creek, the wind picked up dry, wild, carrying the scent of sage. The town was just a smudge behind them now. Nayeli stopped and turned once, just to be sure it was real, that she had left it all behind. No bells, no laughter, no chains. Only the sound of wind and hooves, and the man beside her who didn't ask for thanks. For the first time since morning, she let out a slow breath. It didn't feel like running anymore. It felt like surviving. By the time the sun began to fall, the desert had changed its face. The gold turned to copper, the wind colder, sharper. Nayeli followed the man through a narrow pass between two hills, her legs trembling with exhaustion. Each breath tasted of dust and iron, but she said nothing. There was no one to answer, anyway. He stopped at last near a line of broken rocks where an old cabin leaned against the slope, half wood, half stone, like it couldn't decide whether to stand or give up. He tied his horse to a post, then looked at her. Just a look, steady and quiet, as if asking a question without words. She nodded. It was enough. Inside, the air smelled of ash and old rain. There was a cot in the corner, a rusted kettle, a faded blanket folded neatly on a crate. She touched the wood with her fingertips. It was rough, cold, but it felt more like home than any place she had known in months. He knelt near the hearth, coaxing life back into the ashes. Sparks caught, flared, then softened into a glow that painted the walls amber. Nayeli crouched nearby, watching his hands move steady, practiced, silent. She realized he wasn't avoiding speech. He was simply living without it. When the first flames rose, he gestured toward the cot, then stepped aside. She hesitated, unsure if she deserved rest, unsure if she deserved kindness. But the firelight made her eyelids heavy. She lay down, clutching the blanket, and for the first time that day, warmth touched her skin. Through half-closed eyes, she saw him sitting by the fire, back against the wall, head bowed. The room was filled with quiet, but it wasn't empty anymore. Outside, the desert sighed under the coming night. Inside, two strangers shared a silence that no longer hurt. When Nayeli woke, the fire had died down to a quiet breath of smoke. The air inside the cabin was still, touched by the pale light of dawn that slipped through the cracks in the wall. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was, only that it was quiet, and no one was shouting her name. Then the smell of coffee reached her. He was outside, crouched near a blackened pot set over a small flame. The cowboy. The silent man who had led her out of humiliation and into this strange calm. Nayeli sat up slowly, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. Her body ached, her throat dry, but the pain no longer frightened her. Through the open doorway, she could see him moving with a kind of practiced patience, stacking firewood, checking his horse, his every motion measured, deliberate. The world around him seemed to slow to his rhythm. He looked up once and caught her watching. No words passed. He simply nodded toward the tin cup near the fire. She stepped outside, the cold biting at her bare feet, and took it. The coffee was bitter, thick, and real. She hadn't tasted real in a long time. The morning light spilled across the hills, warming the stones, gilding the dust. She saw now the scars that crossed his throat, pale lines. Long-healed, a map of some forgotten fire. That was why he couldn't speak. And yet, somehow, he spoke more through silence than others did through speeches. When he walked past her, he handed her a small piece of jerky. Not a gift, a gesture. An acknowledgement. We are both still alive. Nayeli held the food in her hand and looked at him, truly looked. For the first time since she could remember, she didn't feel like a burden. She just felt human. The wind carried the scent of sage. The sun climbed higher, and the quiet between them began to feel less like emptiness and more like peace. The days that followed were quiet, marked only by the rhythm of small things. The crackle of firewood, the creak of the door in the wind, the slow drip of water from the tin roof after dawn frost. For the first time in years, no one told Nayeli what to do. There were no commands, no laughter behind her back. Just silence, thick but gentle, like a blanket placed over a wound not yet healed. Elias worked outside most of the day, mending the fence, tending his horse, chopping wood with slow precision. She watched him from the doorway sometimes, studying how he seemed to belong to the earth, how nothing in his movements asked for attention or forgiveness. He simply was. And somehow, that steadiness kept her from falling apart. But nights were different. When the firelight faded and the hills went black, her mind returned to the places she didn't want to go. She saw again the faces of her tribe the day the soldiers came, the screaming, the smoke, her mother's hand pulling her into the trees. She remembered the cold iron of shackles on her wrists, the months of barter and shame that followed, the way white men spoke about her people as if they were animals. Even the one who had promised to save her, Thomas Gable, had only saved her for display. She turned away from those memories, pressing her palms to her eyes. But memory has a cruel patience. It waits for you to tire of pretending. That night, She stepped outside the cabin, needing air. The moon was a thin scar above the ridge, and the desert glowed silver around her. Elias was there too, seated on a flat stone, sharpening a knife in slow, circular motions. He looked up when she appeared, but didn't move. His silence didn't demand explanation. It allowed her to exist, exactly as she was broken, unkempt, alive. She sank down near the fire pit, knees drawn to her chest. The words came without her planning them. "My people used to sing," she whispered, voice cracking. "Now I can't remember the sound." He set down the knife, reached into the pocket of his coat, and pulled out a small piece of wood, a whistle carved roughly by hand. He handed it to her. She hesitated, then took it. The wood was smooth where his fingers had worked it over and over, as if shaped by quiet hours of regret. She raised it to her lips, and the first breath made only a soft, broken note. But the second, clearer, fragile, trembling like the echo of something ancient returning from the dark. Elias smiled barely, just the corner of his mouth. She didn't smile back. Not yet, but something loosened inside her chest. The air around them shifted, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel haunted. She just felt small, human, and strangely safe. The night stretched on in silence, but it was a different kind of quiet now, not the kind that swallows, but the kind that holds. When she finally lay down to sleep, the whistle still warm in her hand, Nayeli thought that maybe the past didn't need to disappear for her to begin again. Maybe it only needed someone to sit beside it without fear, without words. Morning came soft and pale, painting the hills in gold. Nayeli woke to the sound of gentle scraping, the rhythm of Elias's knife against wood. He sat by the door, carving something from a small block of cedar, his back to the sunrise. The light traced the edges of his shoulders, catching the faint scars along his neck. She watched him for a while, half hidden beneath the blanket, wondering what silence sounded like inside his head. Was it as heavy as hers, or was it peace? When she stepped outside, the air smelled of sage and smoke. The mountains shimmered faintly in the distance, still blue with early light. Elias looked up, nodded once, and handed her a tin cup of water. They didn't need words. That was what frightened her most, how easily she began to understand his silences. As the days passed, their world became a quiet pattern. He repaired fences, she gathered wood. He hunted, she cooked. Neither asked permission of the other. It was the first time in her life she felt equal, not owned, not commanded, not watched. Sometimes, when the wind howled through the canyon, she'd catch him watching her hands as she worked, eyes soft but unreadable. Once, when she burned her finger on the pot, he reached instinctively, caught her wrist, then released it too quickly, as if afraid of breaking something fragile. That night, she dreamed of hands hers, and woke with the strange ache of safety. One afternoon, while gathering firewood, she noticed him standing near the old corral, motionless. A small coyote pup was caught in a rusted trap. Its leg bled, eyes wild with terror. Nayeli froze, expecting him to end the creature's suffering. Instead, Elias knelt, slow and steady, and opened the trap with his bare hands. The animal snapped at him, teeth flashing, but he didn't flinch. When it was free, it limped away, disappearing into the brush without looking back. Elias stayed crouched for a while, staring at the blood in the sand, then turned to her, eyes calm, sad, and infinite all at once. That night, Nayeli couldn't stop thinking about it. The way he had risked pain to spare a creature no one else would have noticed. The way he had looked at her afterward, not for praise, not for pity, just recognition. As if he knew exactly what it felt like to be trapped and angry, yet still alive. Later, as she sat by the fire, she found herself tracing the whistle he had given her. She pressed it to her lips, but instead of sound, she breathed softly through it, letting the air move. Not to call, not to sing, but simply to remember she could still breathe freely. Elias stirred, looking up from the shadows. He didn't smile, but something in his gaze eased her chest. He reached into his coat and pulled out what he had been carving that morning, a small figurine of a horse, simple and rough. He set it on the ground beside her boots. It wasn't a gift. It was a story, told without sound. She understood it as such. As the fire flickered lower, Nayeli turned the carving over in her hands. It wasn't perfect, the legs uneven, the head too large, but it was real, shaped by patience and time. Like everything that survived this land. Like her. Outside, the wind sang through the canyon, a voice older than both of them. Inside, she leaned back against the wall, the horse in her palm, and watched him as he cleaned his knife. The shadows danced on his face, softening the hard lines carved by years of solitude. For a long moment, she forgot the weight of her past. The shame, the fear. They had become quieter somehow, shrinking into something she could carry. Nayeli closed her eyes. The desert no longer felt empty. It felt alive in the whisper of the fire, in the slow breath beside her, in the quiet language they were beginning to share. And though neither spoke, both knew. Something had changed. Not love yet, but the ground where love could finally grow. By the end of that week, the hills around the cabin had begun to change. The rains had passed, and the air smelled faintly of wet earth and pine. Each morning, Elias rose before sunrise, his shadow stretching long across the yard as he worked fixing the roof, cutting new posts, mending what time had broken. Nayeli would wake to the rhythm of it, the steady thud of his hammer, the scrape of wood against stone. It was the sound of life continuing, something she had forgotten how to hear. She began to keep her own rhythm too. She cleaned, cooked, gathered herbs she remembered from her mother's hands. At first, she did it to keep busy, to feel useful. But soon, the quiet became something else, something peaceful. It was strange how the stillness no longer frightened her. The silence of Dry Creek had been cruel, meant to humiliate and erase. But here, in this cabin surrounded by wind and wild grass, silence felt like trust. One afternoon, while Elias repaired a section of the fence, she caught herself humming. A small, broken melody, a song she didn't remember learning, maybe one her mother used to sing by the river. The sound startled her. She stopped, half ashamed, but Elias didn't even look up. He just kept working, as if music was the most natural thing in the world. That simple indifference made her brave. She sang a little louder. When the sun began to sink, painting the rocks in orange and rust, she brought him water. He took the cup, nodded his thanks, and pointed toward the horizon where smoke from a distant fire curled into the sky. For a second, fear gripped her chest. Soldiers, raiders, maybe the townsfolk who still whispered her name with disgust. But Elias shook his head slowly, writing a word in the dirt with his finger. Safe. She let out a shaky breath she didn't know she'd been holding. That night, they sat outside near the dying fire. The stars were brighter than she'd ever seen, millions scattered like the ashes of old prayers. Elias whittled another piece of wood, the blade whispering softly with each stroke. Nayeli watched the movement of his hands, the gentleness hidden inside strength. She wanted to ask what he thought about in those long silences, but the words stayed trapped in her throat. Instead, she asked in her mind, "Do you ever miss speaking?" He looked up just then, as if he'd heard. Their eyes met, and he smiled faintly, the kind that said more than answers ever could. Later, when she lay down, she listened to the night sounds, the horses shifting, the wind brushing through the cracks, Elias's slow footsteps outside. She felt the ache of something unfamiliar building in her chest. Not fear, not shame. Something gentler, like belonging. Days blended into one another after that. She learned the shape of his silence, and he learned the rhythm of her breathing. When she forgot herself and laughed, really laughed at a chicken chasing its own shadow, he stopped what he was doing and just looked at her. No smile, no sound, but his eyes softened. She looked away quickly, cheeks burning. It felt like being seen for the first time. At dusk, she would sit by the doorway, brushing her hair while he finished his chores. Sometimes he'd hand her a small thing, a piece of carved wood, a smooth stone, a feather caught in the fence, never explained, never spoken. She began to collect them in a small leather pouch. It wasn't about what they were, but what they meant. That someone thought of her without needing to say it. By the time the first chill of evening came, she realized something had changed. The cabin no longer felt borrowed. It felt theirs. And though she still woke sometimes with the taste of fear in her mouth, it faded faster now, replaced by something she could finally name. Hope. Not loud, not shining, but quiet and patient, like the man who had taught her it was safe to feel again. The first frost came early that year. It crept down from the mountains in thin silver threads, wrapping the hills in quiet. Each morning, Naomi's breath turned white in the air as she stepped outside to fetch water. The world smelled sharper, cleaner, the kind of cold that made every sound ring clear. She had grown used to the rhythm of life with Elias. The silence no longer pressed against her. It moved around her like wind through tall grass. He was steady, dependable, unchanging. And yet, lately, she had begun to sense a shadow in him, something restless that stirred when the fire burned low. One night, she woke to the sound of the door creaking open. Elias had stepped outside, barefoot, his figure outlined against the moonlight. He stood for a long time, staring toward the ridge where the old forest began. The firelight caught his face, and she saw pain there. Not the pain of injury, but the kind that comes from memory. The next morning, she found him by the corral, sharpening his knife. She noticed a faint tremor in his hands. She wanted to ask, "What did the fire take from you?" But she didn't. She had learned that some wounds answered better in silence. That afternoon, while gathering wood near the stream, she found the remains of an old homestead, blackened beams, scattered nails, glass melted into the soil. The sight made her heart tighten. When Elias came to find her, she saw the way his gaze lingered on the ruins. He didn't move for a long time. Then, with his finger, he traced a single word in the ash. Before. She understood. This was where he had lived. This was where the fire had taken his voice and everything else. That evening, the air filled with the scent of pine smoke. Inside the cabin, Elias sat near the hearth, staring into the flames as if searching for something that wasn't there anymore. Nayeli sat beside him, the warmth brushing her skin, the shadows soft against the wall. She wanted to tell him she knew, that she had seen what the fire left behind. But instead, she reached for the whistle he had carved and placed it near the firelight. He looked at it, then at her. With slow, deliberate movements, she drew shapes on the dirt floor, lines that formed a circle, then smaller ones inside. Her tribe's symbol for continuing. Not forgetting, not erasing, just continuing. Elias stared at it for a long time. Then he picked up a piece of coal and added his own mark, a single line through the center, crossing hers. 2 stories, meeting. The room stayed quiet except for the fire's low crackle. Outside, the wind rose, brushing the cabin walls like distant whispers. She remembered her mother's voice, then soft and strong, teaching her that the dead never truly leave. They live in the things we mend, in the people we choose to protect. She looked at Elias, at the calm in his tired eyes. He wasn't her tribe. He wasn't her blood. But when she saw his hand resting on the dirt beside hers, she felt something that went deeper than either a kinship born from shared ruins. Later, as the fire dimmed, Elias reached for the small horse carving she always kept near the door. He set it gently beside the whistle, then nodded once, a gesture that felt like a promise. Not of love yet, but of presence, of staying. That night, Nayeli slept without dreaming. The ache in her chest softened into something almost tender. For the first time, she understood what healing looked like, not erasing the scars, but watching someone else's flame burn beside your own without fear. When she woke in the gray light before dawn, the fire had burned low, but a new warmth lingered in the room. Outside, frost glittered on the earth like silver dust. And through the stillness, she felt it clearly, the pulse of 2 lives no longer running from what they'd lost, but quietly building something in its place. The peace did not last. Nothing in the desert ever does. It began with the sound of hooves, distant at first, then growing heavier, beating against the silence like a warning. Elias heard it before she did. He was at the corral, his body tensing the way wild animals do before a storm. Nayeli stepped outside, her hands still damp from washing, and saw dust rising from the ridge. 3 riders. One carried a rifle across his saddle. And at the front, Thomas Gable. Her stomach turned cold. She hadn't seen his face since the day of the wedding. That moment of public humiliation still burned behind her eyes. But there he was now, clean-shaven, dressed in the arrogance she remembered. His horse stopped a few yards from the fence, and he looked down at her like one might look at something crawling in the dirt. "Well," he said, his voice sharp. Seems the savage found herself a keeper. Elias stood still beside her, his expression unreadable. Thomas's gaze flicked to him. Can't believe it. You really took her in, didn't you? You and your little charity act. He spat into the dirt. You should have left her where she belongs. The words hit Nayeli like stones. But this time, she didn't lower her eyes. She felt Elias beside her, not touching, not shielding, just there. A quiet presence that steadied her breath. What do you want? She asked. Her voice shook at first, then steadied. Thomas laughed. A cruel sound. Closure. Maybe what's mine. Maybe just to remind you what you are. He dismounted slowly, swaggering closer. The men behind him stayed on their horses, faces blank, waiting. Elias took one step forward, calm, silent, immovable. Thomas sneered. Oh, right. The mute protector. Tell me, cowboy, does she even understand you when you grunt at her? He didn't get to finish. Elias's hand moved fast, not striking, not drawing his knife, just gripping Thomas's wrist with enough force to stop breath. The laughter died. Thomas's gun clattered to the ground. Nayeli's heart pounded. She saw it in Elias's eyes, then not rage, but something older, deeper. A warning carved from years of restraint. He released the man, slow and deliberate, letting the silence do what words could not. Thomas stumbled back, his pride shaking harder than his body. Fine, he hissed. You think this changes what she is? You think living with trash makes her clean? He turned toward his horse. The town will hear about this. They'll burn you out. Both of you. Nayeli felt something rise inside her, hot and fierce and ancient. For years, she had swallowed every insult, every lie told about her people, about herself. But not now. Not in front of this man. She stepped forward before Elias could stop her. Her voice came low but clear. You called me savage, she said. But you were the one who left someone standing at the altar, just to make others laugh. You wear your cruelty like it's honor. She took another step closer, until she could see his jaw tighten. I was never the shame you feared. I was the truth you couldn't face. For a moment, no one moved. Even the wind seemed to listen. Thomas mounted his horse without a word and rode off, his men following in silence. When the dust settled, the world felt sharper, emptied of something poisonous. Nayeli stood there, shaking. Elias reached out, not to hold her, but to place a hand lightly on her shoulder, a single, steady touch that said, Enough. You did it. She turned to look at him. The sunlight caught the scars on his throat, and she realized he had been speaking all along, just without sound. Every gesture, every act, every quiet choice had been his voice. The sky above them was a deep, burning blue. And in that moment, Nayeli understood something she hadn't before. Strength wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was the hand that didn't strike back, the silence that refused to bend. She breathed in the dust, the wind, the sun, and it all felt lighter now. The past hadn't disappeared. It had simply lost its power to hurt. The storm came just before nightfall. It rolled across the desert like a living thing, a wall of wind and dust swallowing the horizon. Elias had seen it first. He moved quickly, tying the horse, closing the shutters, his gestures sharp and sure. Nayeli helped him, her heart still raw from the confrontation earlier that day. The memory of Thomas's voice lingered like smoke, but so did the strength she had felt when she finally spoke back. The wind hit the cabin with a hollow roar. Sand rattled against the walls, seeping through cracks, whispering across the floorboards. The fire in the hearth flickered, bending low under the breath of the storm. Nayeli sat near it, pulling her blanket close. Elias joined her, his back against the wall, eyes fixed on the trembling flame. For a long time, neither moved. Outside, the desert screamed. Inside, the world shrank to the rhythm of their breathing. When lightning cracked across the sky, the light flashed through the window, painting Elias's face in white and shadow. She could see the exhaustion there, not just of the body, but of a life lived on guard. And yet, beneath it, there was peace too, a quiet acceptance. She wanted to thank him for standing beside her, for staying. But words felt small. So instead, she reached into the pouch she kept tied at her waist and pulled out the little horse carving he had given her weeks ago. She placed it between them, near the firelight. His eyes softened. He touched the carving with his fingers, then pressed his hand to the floorboards. Slowly, he traced words in the dust. You are home. Something inside her broke not from pain, but from release. She touched the same words with her fingertips, then added her own, just one line beneath. You gave it back to me. The storm raged louder, shaking the walls, but inside the cabin there was stillness, a stillness thick with understanding. Elias looked at her, his eyes darker now in the glow of the fire. He reached out, hesitated, then brushed a strand of hair from her face. It was such a simple gesture, but it felt like a vow. For years, Nayeli had been defined by what men had taken from her: her voice, her pride, her name. But here, in the middle of a storm, beside a man who had no words at all, she realized something. Love didn't always need a promise. Sometimes, it just needed someone to stay when the wind rose. She closed her eyes as the cabin trembled around them. Elias's hand lingered near hers, not holding, not claiming, just there. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of the silence. It sounded like belonging. When the storm finally broke, dawn came soft and silver. The air smelled of wet dust and cedar. The hills shimmered faintly under a thin veil of mist, and the world felt washed clean, quiet again, but in a new way. Not the silence of fear, the silence of peace. Nayeli woke to the soft crackle of dying embers. The fire had burned low, its light golden against the cabin's wooden walls. Elias sat near the doorway, watching the horizon. His hair was damp, his coat dusted with sand. He looked older somehow, and yet lighter, as if something inside him had finally let go. For a while, she simply watched him. The morning light brushed against his face, and she saw the man not as the savior who had pulled her from ruin, but as someone broken too, someone who had chosen, despite everything, to stay kind. She rose quietly and stepped outside. The air bit at her skin, cool and sharp. The desert spread before her, endless and open. She thought of the town she had left behind, the church, the laughter, the ring in the dust, and realized it no longer hurt to remember. That life belonged to another girl, one who didn't know her own strength yet. Behind her, she heard Elias's footsteps. He came to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. For a moment, they just breathed together, two small figures in an endless land. He lifted his hand, hesitated, then traced something in the thin layer of sand at their feet. A small circle. Home. She smiled, then crouched and drew her own mark beside his, a single line through it. Together, they made a new symbol, one that belonged to neither tribe nor town, but to them alone. Elias looked at it, then at her, his eyes reflecting the morning Sunday. He didn't need to say anything. Neither did she. Everything worth saying already lived in the quiet between them. A hawk soared overhead, cutting through the pale sky. The desert wind carried the scent of rain and sage, wrapping around them like a blessing. Nayeli closed her eyes and let it pass over her face. For the first time, she didn't feel small beneath this vast sky. She felt part of it. When she turned back to the cabin, she saw smoke curling gently from the chimney, a thin thread rising straight into the light. There would be more storms, more scars, but they would face them together, not as a savior and the saved, but as two souls who had learned the same truth. That mercy, once given, never fades. It becomes home. And as the sun climbed higher, the land began to glow, a quiet hymn of warmth and forgiveness that no voice could sing, but both of them could finally hear. The storm had passed, but the air still carried its memory. That scent of dust, rain, and something new being born from ruin. For Nayeli, it wasn't the humiliation she endured before that crowd that would stay with her. It was what came after: the long road through silence, the simple acts of survival, and the quiet company of a man who never spoke but somehow always heard her heart. Elias didn't rescue her. He didn't need to. He simply stayed, and in staying, he taught her what mercy really means. Not pity, not forgiveness wrapped in pride, but a kind of understanding that doesn't ask questions, doesn't demand thanks, the kind that exists because kindness itself is enough. There's a line between loneliness and peace, and most of us spend our lives walking it. For years, both of them had lived on the wrong side of that line. He trapped by a silence he didn't choose. She buried beneath words that were never hers. But in that small cabin, with its cracked walls and its fragile warmth, they found something sacred, a space where neither had to be more than human. And maybe that's all love really is. Not grand declarations or promises under a perfect sky, but the steady hand that stays when the wind rises, the quiet presence that turns survival into living. If you listen closely, their story isn't just about two souls in the desert. It's about every person who's ever been left standing alone, every heart that's been told it wasn't worthy of staying. And maybe, if you've lived long enough, you understand this too, that the strongest voices are often the ones that have stopped trying to be heard. Because real love doesn't shout. It lingers soft, patient, like a candle still burning after the storm. So tonight, as you sit in your own kind of quiet, think of them, of the woman who found her voice in silence, and the man who spoke without words. If their story touched something in you, consider passing that warmth to someone else who might be walking through their own dust storm. A gentle word, a helping hand, a small act of mercy. It doesn't take much to change the sound of the wind, because in the end, it's mercy, the quiet kind that builds a home, long after the world has stopped watching.